Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This episode, I wanted to talk about something specifically that's related to DSA and the kind of position of DSA and where DSA is at right now. Because I think that if anybody surveys the landscape, if anybody hears about socialism, they're likely going to hear about it along with DSA, through DSA, in connection with DSA. Maybe it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, maybe it's Bernie talking about democratic socialism. DSA is kind of, I think, a center of gravity right now in American, leftism and certainly in socialism. And so I think it's really useful to talk about kind of what are the discussions that are going on within DSA right now to get an idea as to what is really sort of happening on the ground. And so as an introduction, I think it's important to kind of understand the legacy of DSA, especially when we're talking about DSA's position on electoral politics. It's really important, like all things, to understand historically where it comes from and why it's developed this kind of interesting place that it's at. And so, I don't know how, none of us are like a historian of DSA, but like the quick and dirty history is that DSA has always been this kind of hodgepodge organization of different tendencies and different people who have kind of come together under this very broad idea of like socialism, however you might define that. And I think for a long time, it goes back to big questions in like socialist thought, the question of like reform or revolution. What kind of positions are you taking? Are you taking this like very radical revolutionary stance where you're like not going to participate in bourgeois politics and like just do direct action kind of things? And then there's this whole like, no, we can take over the state through elections and we can, create a set of laws and we can move in that direction. And I think that that's been, two streams in American socialism that have gone sort of all the way through. And I think that when, we could go through and talk about all the different splits and different things like that of different organizations. But in general, there was in the early, 100 years ago, a center of gravity in the United States for American socialism called the Socialist Party. It was the Socialist Party of America. Eugene Debs was its presidential candidate like 3 or 4 times, got millions and millions of votes. And then from that kind of central organization, there was a number of splits. You have different sort of socialist parties. The Communist Party comes out of that. But the Socialist Party kind of remains, but is less of the sort of giant force that it was, winning elections and having mayors and things like that. And so as you get to the Red Scare and the post-war period and McCarthyism, there's this fractured left because of state repression and interfighting and all this kind of stuff, that there's within the Socialist Party a kind of a group that says, let's just try to influence things. Like maybe we're not going to have this broad revolutionary project right now, but like at least we can try to move the ball forward like we did in the 30s to get the New Deal. Like maybe we won't get power through the Socialist Party, but we'll be able to have this incredible impact on the Democratic Party and move it in a way that's going to be able to get closer to social democracy. And so you have, I think, a central figure, Michael Harrington, who coalesces a few different sort of groups in this very pragmatic kind of like, hey, we really just at least want social democracy. We want a good welfare state where people are taken care of and, nationalized or Medicare for all or some kind of, the basic sort of like what everybody got after the war in Europe, right? Like, why didn't we get this? And like, how can we push for this? And so it's an organization, Michael Harrington had contacts with Democratic leaders and presidents, and there's this goal of like trying to make sure that it's kind of anti-communist, right? Anti-Soviet, in the sense of like, we're not wanting to create gulags and dictatorships. We're small d democratic socialists. And that's where the whole tradition of democratic socialism really kind of being social democracy, but wanting to hold on to that socialist title, in many ways, like what happened in Europe, where socialists become social democrats and not really talking about, worker ownership of the means of production or even state ownership of the means of production, but just like strong welfare states and being, having national health care and schools being, affordable, if not free, and things like that. And so DSA develops through kind of bringing in the remnants of like the Students for a Democratic Society and a few of the like this new left group, these old left sort of communist people and stuff like that, trying to bring everybody into like this big tent that's like, look, we all want socialism. We might define that a little bit differently, but we at least all agree that we should make progress towards the betterment of the American society. And so we can create a big organization around that. And that's going to be the Democratic Socialists of America. Like small d democratic, that we want democracy and that we want socialism, and socialism and democracy are linked. And there's like a lot of rhetorical reasons why you do this. And DSA becomes this kind of like fringe, but somewhat influential and has this kind of role to play, but it's pretty minor and is not really on the radar, I think, until 2008. You have this great recession that, like all recessions, shows the contradictions of capitalism very clearly to everybody in a way that people may have not seen in 10 to 15 or even 50 or in some ways 100 years. And so you have a whole new resurgence in critiques of capitalism, anti-capitalist ideas. And DSA is an organization that, unlike even the Communist Party and some other of the parties, is still around and still has an organization and is still able to like grow in membership. And so there's a gravitation towards DSA as just like, well, I don't know if like I don't want to have to go through 6 or 10 weeks of like educational training to like make sure that I'm a cadre member of this like Leninist organization. Like, I don't know all that shit. Like, I just want things to be better, like I just want people to have health care, like that kind of thing. And so DSA grows, I think, from 2008. And as things progress, you get Bernie Sanders, who uses the language of democratic socialism. I think that we can all agree what he really means is social democracy, but he uses democratic socialism, tying in with DSA is sort of like, yeah, we're social democrats, but we're still using socialism as our kind of rallying cry. And DSA just sees this massive increase in membership because I think a lot of specifically young people are fed up and pissed off and see the huge limitations of the system as it exists. And so throughout that whole period, though, DSA never runs a candidate. DSA is not a party. It's like a 504c whatever, or 501c4 whatever. It's like an organization that can do political advocacy but doesn't necessarily run its own candidates. And so I think for a long time, DSA saw itself as a kind of Center for American Progress like organization where it can have these positions, get these tie-ins, and try to move the needle, but is not trying to be a party in and of itself. And so it's got this relationship with electoral politics there where it's like, maybe you have connections with elected leaders and you've got this tie into the Democratic Party. I don't think you have a huge tie in the Republican Party, but you're not really, a third party alternative to the two standard parties. And so this is not a problem until DSA, nears its 100,000 member mark, where it's kind of at now, right? You got like 85,000 members. So it's a big organization and it can be influential in whatever ways, but it finds itself in this moment where it says, look, we've been trying to influence the Democratic Party for a long time, and we've had some modest success, but the new Democrats that came in with Bill Clinton have turned their back on what, I think DSA would want the Democratic Party to be, a more social Democratic Party, and has become a very bourgeois, big business, just sort of like business with a smile instead of like business with a ruthless fist, as the Republican Party, may be more aligned. And so the problem is, or the real question becomes, when you have people who are also DSA members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib who get elected. And so then the question is, well, you're a DSA member, but you're running in the Democratic Party. So are you like DSA or are you a Democrat? And this question becomes extremely important because for a lot of people, there was this idea that there's going to be a new kind of Democrat that's like the DSA Democrat, who is going to be on the left of the party, who's going to move the party to the left, hopefully, or like at least put that kind of pressure within the party. And so the issue is we've kind of seen what's happened with the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the squad, and other DSA people, which is that I think for a lot of us, and I know a lot of people have told me this sentiment, we're frustrated by the fact that what's happened is that these DSA members who run on the Democratic Party essentially become Democrats. There's obviously a big thing on the internet right now, the whole force the vote campaign, whether or not these sort of more left-wing DSA candidates should, be a contrarian force in the Democratic Party and demand a floor vote on Medicare for all in order to give their vote to Nancy Pelosi to be the head of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. And so there's this call to say, well, you're supposed to be these DSA kind of Democrats, and you're not just supposed to be loyal Democrats in the way that every other Democrat is, because you got elected on this idea that you wouldn't be the standard Democrat. But in many ways, people see them as just sheepdogging for the Democratic Party. And I think you see criticism from the Glenn Greenwalds of the world and things like that, that the DSA is really just a kind of organization for the Democratic Party to consolidate the Democratic Party as all, like the Tea Party was a fringe movement of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was able to bring them into the fold. The idea is the Democratic Party will do the same thing with DSA and just kind of bring them into the fold and make them loyal Democrats. And I think that's pissed off a lot of people within DSA and socialists who are looking at DSA as potentially this kind of option. And what's happened is inside of DSA, there's been this conversation about the future, about what do we do about this situation? And so as that is the kind of long background, right? DSA's got this long tradition, this tie with the Democratic Party. It doesn't have its own electoral paths, but it's had this kind of electoral relation that it never really had before, where you have DSA members who strategically run as Democrats in order to kind of use the party machinery. But the idea was when you get elected, you really kind of are a DSA person and not really a Democrat. But it hasn't happened in practice. And so there's a question within DSA is like, how do we react to this? And so that's all a setup so that I'm going to give it over to Brandon to explain the kind of discussion that's going on within DSA right now about the dirty break, sort of where this idea comes from, and what are the kind of, there's essentially sort of three positions, and there's a sort of, I want a clean break from the Democratic Party. There's the, no, we should just go into the Democratic Party and move it to the left as possibly as we can, or realign the Democratic Party to be a social democratic party. That's the traditional line of DSA. Or this middle road, the so-called dirty break, which is that we stay aligned or we run on the Democratic ballot line where it's strategically useful, but we also start running our own candidates in order to prepare ourselves to be a kind of third party. So Brandon, where does this idea sort of come from? And then, give us a little bit of flavor in terms of what this looks like in terms of internal discussions within DSA.
Yeah, totally. Well, first off, thanks for having the episode on this subject. I think it's super useful and it absorbs a lot of my time and energy thinking about it in terms of conversations in DSA right now. And so I think the first thing to recognize is, to those who would say that the DSA is functioning as a sheepdog for the Democrats, that is a very one-sided way of looking at it, in that DSA is very much contested territory right now. It is, I think, its future in terms of whether it will play that role or not is super undetermined. And there are, debates raging about that in the organization. I think in many ways, DSA, since Trump came into office in 2016, or since he was elected in 2016, I think that's sort of the a breaking point where you can draw a sort of year zero line where the DSA since then is a different organization than it was before that, in terms of just massively ballooning in size in a short period of time, and having the average age of the members drop considerably. I think it was, I forget the numbers, but it was something like average age of a member was 72 or something, or maybe in the 60s, and, prior to that. And after that, it was like, 33 or something like that. So it was a huge shift. And so yeah, this is very much a fresh question. And so the tradition of what DSA has stood for in the past isn't so much the operative pressure here, but more the practical pressures of the movement today that's sort of having its impact on how this is going. So yeah, I think just to sort of look at the landscape, you've got since 2016, in both the 2017 and 2019 national DSA conventions, there's been sort of steps taken in the direction of DSA shifting its positions that it had held historically about the goal being to shift the Democratic Party to align with workers' interests, and towards a recognition that the task was actually to figure out a way to build a working class party, a party of the working class that's not dependent on the organizations of the capitalist class. Of course, there's never been any resolution about how do you get there, what do you do that to get there, but I think there's been steps taken at the last couple of conventions. But now I think there's a bit of a questioning in that we've seen so much apparent success running on the Democratic Party ballot line with figures like Bernie and AOC and coalescing this massive movement. So I think in some ways, actually, I think the discussion is maybe even slightly regressing to the stage of questioning, well, do we need to form a separate party, or can we just work with the Democrats? It seems like we're making headway doing that. There's gains being made. So can we do that? And so in answer to that question, yeah, I think one of the key trends is the people who favor a clean break, which is sort of the classic Marxist position in the US, where you stand wholly apart from the Democratic Party. You say that workers should abandon it and form or join a socialist party or a broader working class party instead. And those who agree with that should just go do it. And the main advantage of that is that the message is clear. We can't rely on the Democrats or any political representative of the ruling class. Workers and capitalists have nothing in common in terms of their interests. We shouldn't be in the same party. We shouldn't be working together. It sends the political message very clearly. And so that's the advantage of it. I think the disadvantage is there exists this real leftward moving movement behind Sanders and AOC and so on that you sort of cut yourself off from in a way if you adopt an overly rigid tactical approach of opposing or at least sort of refusing to endorse or get your hands dirty by campaigning for Sanders or AOC. If you do that, then there's a whole layer of people where you're sort of on the sidelines criticizing what's happening in the mass of the movement rather than sort of participating in it and trying to move it forward. So that's the sort of drawback of the clean break approach. Whereas on the other side, yeah, DSA's traditional position has been realignment, which would be trying to make the Democratic Party into a pro-worker party. And, usually the argument for that centers around, well, look, there's this two-party stranglehold on US politics through undemocratic ballot access laws, through just the whole way the first past the post system is set up and winner take all elections. And so it just, all of these things together sort of essentially rule out any viable third party efforts. And so the only viable path, the sort of left wing of the possible, as Michael Harrington put it, is to try to retake the Democratic Party would be the argument. And I think that's been the dominant approach on the US left, non-Marxist US left since the 1930s and has repeatedly failed, in my opinion.
Right. Has not been successful.
Yeah.
Right.
Although, of course, proponents would argue that neither has the strategy of trying to form a separate party. So,
Right.
um,
Because it's
so
not like
just
there isn't a dearth of political parties, that are avowedly Marxist, right? Like the CPUSA is a political party. The Socialist Party USA is still around. You have a number of different parties that, in principle, could technically and do run their own presidential candidates, but like are very limited in their ability to run congressional candidates in different places. I mean, the most successful you have is Socialist Alternative getting Shama Sawant elected, which is one person, in a city council seat in one city, in Seattle, which has its own interesting political history and things like that. So it's like you're saying, there's not been a lot of success of, an alternative to the big parties.
right. So that said, I think it's failed on more than one level, the realignment strategy, in that it's not only sort of failed in the sense of the Democratic Party hasn't been taken over, but I think it's failed in terms of the political impact on its participants. So I think, like, if you look at, for instance, the labor movement or the civil rights movement, like, you had a whole section of the civil rights movement that effectively went into the Democratic Party, but rather than transforming the Democratic Party, they were the ones who were transformed. And there's the example of Bobby Rush, Congressman Bobby Rush, who had co-founded the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers, who then went on to endorse first Michael Bloomberg and then Joe Biden in the Democratic primaries this past cycle, right? So, it's sort of, anyway, that's one example among many, but where you sort of see the logic of where that ends up heading in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the approach that I favor is the dirty break, though even what that means is contested territory, and so there's many flavors of how people would define that. But yeah, the way I would put it is that it takes the best parts of both the clean break strategy and the others by sort of like the clean break, it acknowledges that we need a new party, that the Democratic Party is structurally a party of corporate America, and so it's not a question of sort of just moving it to the left or having some sort of reform of that party. We need a fundamentally different party, but instead, but it also at the same time takes on, unlike the clean break, the concerns that people have about, we're not ready yet. There's too many undemocratic ballot access laws. The spoiler effect is an issue, and we say, like, okay, those are real issues. We're not going to argue that doesn't exist, but we still need a new party. So is there a way we can get there anyway? And so we would treat the question of what ballot line do you run on as a tactical question, but still remaining committed to the political principle of workers need their own party, and whatever we do tactically, that should be the political content that we imbue what we're doing with. And so we should lay the basis through that to build a new party. And so we can run on the Democratic ballot line sometimes if it makes sense, but we still have to maintain a clear socialist political profile and program. We need to raise money independently from working class people, not sort of build ourselves around the Democratic Party establishment. That's sort of the only way we're going to lay a successful basis to break the masses of people from the Democratic Party.
So I want to bring in Aaron. Aaron, you had the experience of, organizing pretty heavily with DSA, in the DC metro area and stuff like that. And there were campaigns in which Metro DSA was involved in, the sort of electoral work that DSA is kind of doing, I think, without a clear direction, which is what has brought up this conversation on the dirty break. And I remember having a few conversations with you in which you were quite frustrated with the way DSA related to some of these electoral, campaigns and things like that. What kind of perspective, having been on the ground, do you kind of bring to this discussion of the dirty break?
I think that's valid. I mean, I think, as Brandon mentioned, I mean, so far the approach has really just been endorsing candidates who came to us and asked for an endorsement, and if their platform was sufficiently, progressive or DSA friendly, we typically went ahead and in some cases we went all in and just put all of our forces into campaigning for them and helping them build it, which I guess has had varying success in what I've seen. I mean, I think the Metro DC chapter specifically had some good success with like Lee Carter. He's been pretty loyal and has been pretty good about following through with the promises he made in his campaign. But there have also been some where the campaign either just fell apart or just hasn't really gained the traction. And so I think it is hard. It's hard to find that balance between a candidate that ultimately does have to toe the Democratic Party line to run as a Democrat, but can still be loyal to DSA and kind of socialist values. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge without having your own platform and having your own candidates that you can vet and put forward.
I think in the early discussions with Brandon about like setting up this episode and stuff like that, you and I were both much more skeptical of the dirty break as a legitimate kind of strategy. And I still have, I think somewhat legitimate concerns. I mean, I think one, the Democratic Party is a giant combine and the place where social movements go to die. And I think even progressive candidates and even the most progressive people end up becoming significantly less progressive. I think that there's been a lot of obviously disappointment with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and specifically, and even Bernie. I mean, I think a lot of people are fairly disappointed, with the kind of significant link with the Democratic Party and how the Democratic Party is much more able to maintain control over candidates than are candidates able to put pressure on a way that actually moves the Democratic Party. We're hearing that we're not even going to get potential, a COVID stimulus thing until March because of the Democratic Party. And it isn't as if the AOCs of the world are able to move the needle at all on that. And so Brandon and even Aaron, you guys, I'm curious to just have this conversation about the Democratic Party is, in my view, such a dead end that the idea of even running a candidate within the Democratic Party is going to spoil the candidate, right? Whatever positions, and like to your experience, Aaron, you might have a candidate who espouses good values and a good platform. Like, I'm for Medicare for all, and I want to, defund the police and invest in mental health services more or whatever, and have these kind of things that we could all agree on, but are, when they're part of the Democratic Party, just unable to do anything about those. So even if they have good policies, it doesn't matter because they have this, there's Democratic Party rules, there's the kind of unwritten rules of like, get in line or fuck you, there's all these kinds of things. And so how would you answer the skeptical person who says, this is fucking stupid because the Democratic Party is just going to eat all of these people up. They're going to turn them into loyal Democrats, and we need a new party now. Because this is an argument you hear. And so, either one of you guys jump in. I'm curious about, like, give me the idea that it's worth it to run as a Democrat. Silence.
I can come in. I've spoken more than Aaron, so I don't know if he wants to say something first.
Nope, this one's all you. Go for it.
All right, sounds good. Well, I agree with what you said about the Democratic Party being a dead end. I think there's no way that you're going to turn the Democratic Party into something better than what it is.
But you're talking about candidates within it.
Yeah. So that seems like a contradiction. I'm going to try and unify the pieces of that contradiction.
Mark says contradictions are great, right? It's okay.
Yeah. Well, first off, let's just acknowledge what the starting point is. Let's imagine that Marxists do nothing and are not part of this conversation, and things just play out the way they're going right now. The default thing that's happening among the masses of progressive people that are trying to make some kind of progressive change is the Bernie-crat model of trying to run as a left-wing Democrat. And on the surface, it seems to be, I know you said there's lots of people frustrated with AOC, which is true, but I think there's even more people that are, looking to that as the model. Yeah. I think it's true, there's a significant number on the left that are frustrated with that. But I think the broader perception is that's working, that's the way to go, that's the future. And so I think, so that's the sort of thing that as a Marxist, you're coming in and trying to impact in some way. And so the question is the more effective way to impact that process to say, this is dumb, this is not going anywhere, this is a dead end, what are you even doing? You're wasting your time, come form a new party over here with me, which I'm going to go do now. I tend to think that that will not work very well. I think people will not see that as realistic and will see that as disconnected from the struggles that they're trying to engage in right now, and will continue to try to get left Democrats elected, but will continue to not have good ways to sort of hold them accountable or lay the basis for a future party or whatever, because I think they will buy into the sort of realignmentist ideas that Sanders and AOC and so forth have advocated. So in that context, I think the question is, how do you have an impact? And I think it's by participating in that struggle alongside the people who are attempting this realignment strategy, but without sort of giving credence to the realignment goal, saying that, look, I want these policies too. I want Medicare for all. I want to defund the police. I want a Green New Deal. Honestly, though, I think that what's going to be necessary to get these things is mass politically independent struggle by an organized working class movement that has its own political representation, its own party. And so I think that as we're doing this, we need to be laying the basis for that new party and not be looking towards the Democrats as the long-term solution here. And I tend to think that that is an easier way to get a hearing if you are doing that work alongside people that are having that struggle, and putting it forward as a constructive, positive suggestion within that context of solidarity and mutual struggle. And so I think and I also just want to point out that I think broadly, and I think you've mentioned this on podcasts before, that there is wide support for the idea of a third party that, is viable. People would like a third party to be viable, but they don't see that as realistic. They don't see a path towards a third party that has a meaningful impact on U.S. politics, other than just being a spoiler potentially, or what have you. So I think if you can sort of paint a picture of concrete steps that can be taken in the here and now to get in that direction, that is how you can win people over to that idea. Because I think, for whatever, at least in the DSA, there's very, very few illusions in the Democrats as a good force. Like, they recognize, even among those who think it can be transformed, they recognize that the current Democratic establishment is complete crap and is our enemy.
Yeah, it's why people go to DSA rather than just join the Democratic Party, right? Like, they don't go to their local Democratic Party and say, I want to be involved in the party machinery. They've already committed themselves to some kind of outside organization, which is, I think, some reasons why I'm sure there's a frustration within DSA about even this dirty break strategy. It's like, I joined DSA to get away from the Democrats, and now you're telling me that you want to run Democrats? Like, the fuck? Like, what are we doing? And there's a double-edged sword to the pragmatism here, right? The pragmatism within DSA is a long tradition. It's like, Michael Harrington was like the socialist pragmatist, right? Like, I just want to do what works, man. I want to find the avenue that works and take advantage of that. And this dirty break is a way of saying, let's look at the actual situation that we're dealing with and say, a clean break gets us to be the CPUSA, and the realignment strategy doesn't work because we've tried it and it doesn't work. So this is the only option we have. This is the pragmatic position, is to, but I think what I'm curious about, from Aaron, from your perspective, is within DSA, right? The thing that for me as a recent, I actually finally made the decision to put my money in, and I became the DSA member, because part of my thing was just there's 50,000 different tendencies within DSA. In some ways it's nice because it's this survey of the American left, and you get people who are fuck electoral politics and fuck all this stuff. We just want to start burning buildings, and then you've got this oh no, we need to slowly but surely move the Democratic Party back to FDR, and so it's an organization that's got these two like very far apart ideas, and I'm wondering, like, if, obviously it's just maybe your appreciation of Metro DSA in particular, but I think it's a snapshot of the organization as a whole. How fragmented is DSA, and in your view, like, is there even a possibility of getting these groups to align in such a way that DSA might be genuinely able to like have a position and hold it, right? Because you have issues like, it's not like DSA not only is not a democratic centralist organization where you can have this debate and then you make a decision and like everybody agrees. It's like specifically has issues with members who are part of democratic centralist organizations. So how, the theory might be good and the pragmatism might be understandable, but is it realistic to even assume that DSA can do this from your perspective?
It's a fair question, and it's kind of tough to gauge. I mean, so my involvement was primarily with the chapter. I didn't really focus on left Twitter. I didn't get too involved in national platforms and things like that. I was there to do. I know, I was there to do the work. I wanted to be just rank and file behind the scenes, doing what I could. So it's a tough call, but it is hard to reconcile that. I mean, as you said, the spectrum is far and wide. DSA's tent is very big. And there are some people who were single-mindedly focused. There were comrades who were willing to move to Iowa to influence, the primary caucuses there. And there were those of, to your point, really just wanted to be out in the streets chanting and moving forward. I think a lot of that, to Brandon's point, is because of the rebirth of the organization after 2016, after Trump's election. It really brought in a lot more people who just wanted kind of a visceral response to what was happening, rather than people that had the long game in mind, myself included. I mean, I joined in late 2016, early 2017, so I kind of fall in that category too. But I mean, it's hard to corral these different groups and tell them that, hey, electoral politics is the way. I know that DSA's accomplishment of its growing membership, and now 90,000 or so, whatever it is now, is certainly commendable, but it is ultimately a drop in the bucket, and it's hard to know when we would reach the capacity to where we could focus on multiple different avenues and really kind of be to approach this idea of socialism in different avenues, rather than trying to focus all of our energy towards either an electoral process or kind of a grassroots campaign, or worker organization, whatever it may be. So it's tough. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I think that the will is there in the organization, but I think it needs a push from leadership. And I don't know if you'll ever get full buy-in, but you'll certainly get enough to where you can make an impact if you have a good strategy.
So let's talk about the question of leadership, though, because I think that's very important. Aaron, you've got a perspective, having been in part of the leadership in at least a chapter. Right. And I think for me, the leadership question there, we were talking about this, and there's a kind of chicken or egg thing that I feel like, right, which is that in order to move the party in some direction, you have to have leadership, and you have to show leadership, but you also have to be in leadership to change the policies, change the platform, move the party in a certain direction. So you need that kind of leadership. But in order to solidify that leadership and actually get elected to positions in DSA that will be able to do that, you need to convince the rank and file to support you. And so leadership depends on the rank and file support, but support depends on the leadership. And so I feel like, having only been in DSA for like a week, but having viewed it from afar pretty intently, and seeing what's going on and watching conventions and things like that, that there is a not a leadership vacuum, but it seems like the leadership of DSA is fairly consolidated, and dare I say, in terms of the DSA, somewhat conservative. And while there may be this growth of new people who, maybe even tend to be ultra left, and less interested even in electoral politics, the leadership of the DSA, because of time in the organization and the ability to coalesce groups and things like that, does not tend to reflect, the rank and file. So, like, was that your experience that there's this difference between the leadership and the sort of rank and file, and there's not the ability. It makes it much harder to lead and actually move the organization. Or like, I'm curious about the perspective you have from your experience, because I know, we've talked about it, and you are not as involved now. There's been a burnout effect that position had on you, and so I want to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is, I guess, a good disclosure to say that I really have not. I've been a paper member for almost the last 2 years now, I guess. So my experiences are somewhat isolated and somewhat removed from what the current situation might be, but that's accurate. I mean, I think my experience with kind of DC organizing in general across different organizations that I was involved with is that it really tends to lean kind of anarchist, which is surprising for being kind of the political center of the US.
Maybe.
But but in that sense, I mean, yeah, so like our chapter steering committee never really took firm stances. It was really always just trying to allow the rank and file members to come to their own conclusions. Everything was tried to be put to votes and things at chapter meetings. I don't feel like our steering committee really ever laid out a lot of kind of a clear course of action because of that, because we were so diverse in that big tent nature of it. And I mean, DC in particular, our chapter was, obviously pretty large. I think a couple thousand members when I left. So it's hard. Again, it's hard to corral socialists of different stripes or leftists of different stripes and get them to agree on a strategy, to get them to agree on tactics, to get them to agree on, a definition of what the goal is, of what the end game is. So yeah, I mean, that's my experience. I don't know what national is. I don't know if Brandon has more insight into the national aspect of it.
Well, I just wanted to reply to something you, Kevin, said a bit ago about, like, so you want us to run as Democrats then, given all the issues with the Democratic Party? And my response is no, I don't want to run as Democrats. And I think, like, even the people who, in my opinion, are to the right of me but still favor the dirty break, I don't think even they would argue like we want to run as Democrats. I think anyone who advocates a dirty break strategy would say that we unfortunately are in the position where we are stuck running as Democrats because of the restrictive ballot laws, because of the reality of the U.S. political situation. But that is not what we want, and we would like to find a way to not have to do that. And so I think, like, I wish that if it were an option to just tomorrow the base of Bernie Sanders supporters breaks away and never looks back and forms its own party separate from the Democrats, I think that would be better. But wishing for that to happen won't make that happen. And so is there a way to, actually get there and take steps that will lay the basis for being able to accomplish that at some point? And I think that that's where, for me, that's primarily a political question. And what I like about the dirty break strategy is the way that it assigns tactics to its proper place. I don't think it makes sense to make a fetish or a principle out of any particular tactic, be it, running on the Democratic Party ballot line, or be it running independently. The question is, what is the political content you're organizing around? And so for me, that would be true even if we didn't run in any elections. Just like the question of what is this thing we're building, the DSA? There's this big picture question. Is what we're building like a pressure group on the Democrats, or is it something that's trying to take over the Democrats, or is it something that's trying to form an alternative to the Democrats? Is it trying to launch something bigger in the future? What is this thing that we're doing? And that whether we're doing actions in the streets or whether we're running candidates, there's just this question of what is this organization we're building? And so I'm firmly of the opinion that we should be saying that we should be putting forward a political analysis that says the Democratic Party is a big business party. It is an enemy of working people. It rules on behalf of the capitalist class. Even when it gives concessions, it's doing that to try to keep up the stability of the capitalist system, not for the benefit of working people. And put forward that we need our own working class source of power that we organize around. But then within putting forward that sort of idea and infusing that into all the work that we do, then there's the tactical question of what actual steps do we take. And so I think that there's totally room for debate and disagreement on what those steps should be. And I do think that whatever you spoke about, the sort of seeming contradiction, chicken or egg problem between the rank and file and the leadership on questions. And I mean, it's more apparent than real in the sense that it's sort of like Zeno's paradox the idea that mathematically all movement should be impossible because there's an infinite series of halfways between any point A and any point B, but obviously we all know that movement does happen, and we all know that ideas do change. We've seen changes in ideas and consciousness and what people think in organizations over time. So yes, on paper, it might seem like the leadership has to change for the rank and file to change and vice versa. So neither one's possible, but empirical observation refutes that. So I think that the best way is to sort of cut the Gordian knot and just move forward on both those fronts by trying to both, I think, do things like move resolutions at the National DSA Convention, which my caucus, Reform and Revolution, is going to, be trying to do in conjunction with as many other forces as we can, find agreement with, potentially on things like committing National DSA to let's launch a campaign aiming at 150,000 members under a slogan like, join the Socialists for a mass democratic socialist party, and that we launch a national campaign on that basis, that we hire a couple full-timers to organize that, that we devote $100,000 or more to in seed money to that we identify the 10 most strategically advantageous races across the country to run independently on, and that we focus the whole national organization at that point of attack, where all the electeds and all the people running are asked to, support each other in making those races a success, in promoting those races, and in putting forward this common analysis of the need to lay the basis for a new party. I think all of that would be a big step forward. It wouldn't mean that we take an absolute approach of saying we hereby declare as the delegates to the National Convention, the DSA will run no Democratic Party candidates or whatever, and that we make a clean break with that. We still sort of allow that to take place and that logic to play out. But alongside that, we start taking steps and laying the basis concretely for independent runs, and we start talking about how to coordinate those nationally, how to hold each other accountable, how to devote national resources and organizational resources to those campaigns, which I think is one of the pieces actually of holding candidates accountable, in that if the candidates are reliant on DSA for their campaigns funding and support and promotion or whatever, that creates more of an obligation to remain true to the wishes of DSA members than it is if DSA is sort of just a paper endorsement and you were running anyway and didn't really need them.
But what are the balance of forces that would that make, like, right, if we're talking about pragmatism and stuff like that, right? Like, okay, let's say, and I still think there's many questions, but let's say we're on board and okay, we're dirty breakers, right? But if you survey DSA in terms of the conversations you've had and just sort of where things are at, like to Aaron's point, I mean, it's harder to wrangle socialists than it is cats, right? I mean, these are like super independent people usually at the time, a lot of different ideas about how things are going. What are the actual balance of forces within DSA in terms of, if we're just thinking about the three big camps of realignment, clean break, and dirty break, right? It's such that, what is the possibility of this happening at the next convention or something like that, right? I mean, because I think for those of us who have lived long enough politically through being just deceived by and frustrated by and annoyed by and ready to set fire to the Democratic Party, like I want this to happen, as fast as we can, but it's not going to happen unless the balance of forces are such that it would actually happen. What is it? What, from your perspective, what does it look like right now? And I mean, you've got the Reform and Revolution Caucus has had a magazine devoted to this issue, and showing the different groups within DSA, like Left Voice and other like groups within DSA who are also supportive of the dirty break, and even the cleanest of dirtiest breaks, you might say. Like, there's obviously support for it. Do you think that the support is overwhelming, 50-50? Are they split? Is it split equally between the three? How do you see where things are at? Which, I mean, obviously informs what it is that you do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so yeah, in the latest issue of the magazine, it features a debate between a number of different groups, some of which are in DSA, some of which are just more like DSA adjacent or half in, half out, whatever. But yeah, with a range of opinions, all of whom favor a break, but some would put forward a more clean break strategy, some a dirty break strategy, and then with shades of opinion within each of those. And it's definitely worth reading to just get a sense of that. And then, of course, not featured in that issue, but also in existence, is the realignment oriented folks who have sort of committed to a long-term strategy of working within the Democratic Party. I think one of the functions of the National Convention is to gauge this balance of forces and to be concrete about that. I think it's tough to know, like, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I have one like sample, but I certainly don't know, like, have any scientific sample of where things are nationally. And I think that's sort of the function of the convention. But if we go to the 2019 convention, obviously the resolution affirming that that DSA sets the goal of forming an independent working class party, and that in the meantime, it remains permissible to run on the Democratic Party ballot line. That position did carry the day at that convention. So that, that snapshot, I think it's clear in 2019, the dominant view in DSA was effectively a dirty break strategy. It didn't use that word, but that's, a description that would fall under that umbrella, in my opinion. So, since then, I think those of us in the Reform and Revolution Caucus have been thinking like, well, yeah, that's a good starting point, but let's flesh that out. And I think the thing we've experienced the most is people who on paper say that they support the dirty break and would sign on to a resolution like that, but who in practice, I think, view the dirty break as, okay, right now we run on the Democratic Party ballot line and work within the Democrats. And then as we sort of heighten the contradictions within the Democratic Party through that process, we, in the future, that will pose concretely the practical steps of building a new party. And so there's this disconnect, right, where there's the dirty part now, where we work in the Democrats, and then, whatever, black box in the middle with a question mark on it. And then on the other side, there's a new party somehow. I disagree with that approach to the dirty break. I think that is not the correct way to handle it. I think both aspects of the dirty break need to be, in order for it to be effective, need to be present the entire time. You can't relegate the break part to the indefinite future. You need to start laying the basis for it now. And so I think the approach we've taken is to sort of take the dirty break as formulated on paper and try and make that a reality, as opposed to the current disconnect that there's what people have agreed to on paper versus what has actually been carried out. And I think trying to bring, sort of point to that DSA has resolved that it stands for this, but what has it actually done in practice? And so let's bring our practice in line with what we've said we stand for on paper. And so I think that's sort of the angle that we've taken, and that it's not that people don't want to do it, but it's more like, I think people, whatever, I can't psychoanalyze. It's entirely possible that there are some people that are using the dirty break to, like, in a disingenuous way, basically not to actually try to move Democratic Party supporters towards a break, but rather to move people who want to break into the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
There might be people trying
Just
to
to
use
be
it
dirty.
consciously, cynically like that. But, you know, I'm not going to assume that that's the case. I think, like, even if I take people at their word, you know, that that they want to break, but they sort of, I think, don't have a concrete sense of what are the steps we take to do that. So I think hopefully by putting forward, here are some things we can do. Here is a resolution that commits to it, a specific set of steps. And also, I think at the same time, we should put forward another resolution, or at least discussion document or something that, like, the things I mentioned so far were sort of more the organizational side of things, like running candidates and launching campaigns and so forth. But then I think another one should be, what is our political program? What do we stand for?
Right.
Both in terms of policy and in terms of, like, the analysis we put forward. So running on a clear working class left program and refusing corporate donations and promoting the message that the Democratic Party is dominated by corporate interests. And
see, now this is where you get in trouble, right? Like, this is like, we had a discussion about this, and that's where I want Aaron's perspective, right? Because, okay, we've talked about this, and to kind of put it out there, right? It seems essential to me to say that if you're going to adopt the dirty break strategy, when you run in the Democratic Party, you have to do a better job than has happened previously about about putting flags in the ground and stating your position and making sure that you're not going to compromise on these positions, right? And so it's things like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, but there's two that are going to be, well, there's one in particular that's going to be problematic for the Democratic Party, and there's one that may be problematic for the candidate. The idea that you would maintain criticism of the Democratic Party, right? So, like, there's members of the Democratic Party who support the Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. The Democratic Party can support having those voices within it because the majority of the party doesn't support it. So, like, yeah, fringy freaks, whatever, talk about your shit, but no one's going to support you. So, like, speak into the ether, have fun and go to your parties and whatever. But, like, so that's, the Democratic Party can absorb that. What the Democratic Party can't absorb is to have a candidate who specifically states that the Democratic Party is the problem, right? Like, the Democratic Party is an organization that has control, leadership, the ability to take a more radical voice and diminish it because of the power plays it can do. My fucking phone is making these vibrating these things. God, I thought I turned it off. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, everyone's gonna hear that and be like, "What an idiot! He's got a podcast. He can't even turn off his phone." Whatever. So and then there, you were talking about, I think the thing that Shama Sawant did, and that also sort of alternative talked about when it ran candidates, was that the candidate is only going to take the average worker salary. So the Democratic Party, I think, won even on both of those issues. The first one is a non-starter. They're not going to accept, essentially, that a candidate is going to be critical of the party itself. Like, we looked at that too, and it's technically in the rules, and we can talk about people who have essentially been critical of the Democratic Party yet still run inside of it, and the Democratic Party seems to be okay with that, depending on the other politics that it has, and whether or not it might be, like, how that criticism can be tamped down if you actually get elected. And there is a difference between someone's criticism during the election, and then after it, once they become an actual, like, member of the legislative party. You know, if we look at it, something like the Labor Party, where there's the rank and file party and then there's the parliamentary party, because I think there is a difference that, you know, you are kind of in the rank and file during the election, and then you become part of the parliamentary party, which is very much about control, solidarity. You know, we're moving in blocks and things like that. You can't be a voice inside the party that's critical of the party, because you're going to either get kicked out of the party, or you're going to be so diminished in your ability to make any kind of headway that no one's ever going to hear what you have to say. And so, and then on just like taking the standard average worker salary, the Democratic Party, just like the Republican Party, is going to argue, oh no, we need to encourage the best and brightest, right? And in order to do that, you need to have a competitive way. You need to actually make it like, you're not going to take someone who's got $100,000 job and say, oh no, you're going to make, $40,000 because now you're a representative in Congress, right? Like that's just like, to me, in terms of even the Democratic Party, the standard Democratic Party ideology, a non-starter. So the idea that like you might have the Democratic Party go, yeah, sure, like go ahead, but make sure that you give the rest of that money to the Democratic Party because you're in the Democratic Party. You owe us your seat, right? And so shut the fuck up on your criticism and give us the money if you're not going to take it because we deserve it because we're the ones who got you in power. And I like, frankly, those are strong arguments to me. I mean, Aaron, I'm curious, if you want to expand on this sort of criticism, because I think you and I were, in lockstep in terms of thinking this feels like a non-starter in terms of like, if this, it seems like from the DSA position, that's a demand. Like in order to differentiate the DSA Democratic candidates from your standard Democrat, you need to have a position that they could stay. And if one of those is criticism of the Democratic Party, it seems like a non-starter.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that was kind of one of my first concerns about this approach as well too, and why I was kind of leery of this dirty break approach. The Democratic Party can censure you, it can expel you, it can keep you off the primary ballot, it can change the rules at the state level pretty much whenever it wants, if it so chooses. It has a lot of ways of keeping the candidates in line, and there's only so much criticism that it will tolerate. To Kevin's point, I mean, they do allow, AOC's fiery rhetoric. They do allow some of this criticism and class conscious discussion because it ultimately gives them credibility as being progressive, whereas the actual, machinations of the party still support the capitalist class. So I think there will definitely come a time where that conflict becomes, no longer tolerable, and they start cracking down and they start changing the rules and they start refusing to let these candidates on their primary ballots, or they start censoring them, or whatever the case may be. And so that does make it challenging how this can be kind of a viable longer term strategy, particularly when you start ramping it up. So far, the endorsements that DSA has provided for some of these Democratic candidates have been beneficial to the Democratic Party. So they probably allowed some of the, anti-capitalist sentiment to seep through. But, Brandon, I know in some of your writing, you kind of have those key things like not accepting corporate donations is going to put these candidates at a strong disadvantage in the general elections. And, the Republicans are going to, or the other parties, I guess, are going to dominate the airwaves, dominate the messaging, and potentially win these. That's going to be seen as a losing strategy by the Democrats, and they will try to block any candidate that runs on that campaign. I think these are huge roadblocks. I mean, I think these are definitely things that will create challenges for even just maintaining a voice in the Democratic Party, let alone winning elections against the other side.
Well, I think these are totally valid points to bring up, but I think there are also points that are sort of anticipated and brought on board by proponents of the dirty break strategy, in the sense that, well, so first off, in my view, again, like I think this is a way I differ from a lot of the other people who would say they are dirty breakers, but I don't view it as a long-term strategy. I view it as a short-term strategy, or a medium-term strategy. I mean, it's very hard to put exact times on things when you're talking about politics and that thing, whatever events take the pace they take. But, I think broadly in the next, like, one or two presidential election cycles, I would like to see, in the next 4 years would be ideal, there would be the process of setting up a Democratic Socialist Party. And so, yeah, I fully agree. Like, I think even, we might disagree on the time scale, but any dirty break favoring person would say that, like, it is inevitable that the Democrats at a certain point will crack down and will not let you move any further. And that, that would be a point at which you would, have to start thinking about your own party. That would be, that's what they mean when they talk about heightening the contradictions inside the Democratic Party, and sort of bringing them to a boiling point. That's sort of when you make that conflict break into open civil war, I guess, between the wings of the Democratic Party, then that's when the process out of which a new party would form.
We are seeing some of this with the Republican Party right now too. I think like it's illustrative. There is the kind of Trump wing of the Democratic or the Republican Party, and then there's the more traditional kind of governing part of the Republican Party, and it's not quite to the point where you're seeing the Republican Party crack down and actually start pushing people out. But I think, if you hear rumblings of somebody like Trump suggesting that there might be a third party and people, in the Republican Party gravitating towards that, that's when you might see a kind of crackdown. So it's, in American politics, it's not crazy to think that there is going to come a point where the traditional parties say, no more of this. We've dealt with a lot of outsiders to such a degree that we can't handle it anymore. And so you're either in or out, and makes a decision point for people. It's interesting in some ways that it's happening both on the right and the left, for different and sometimes similar reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to a general sort of emptying out of the center and the discrediting of the traditional parties of the status quo capitalist establishment. I mean, really one of the longest standing political regimes in world history, in that you've had the same two-party system since the Civil War. Most countries around the world, as you mentioned earlier, got disrupted by World War II, and so have not, have had a break in their regimes in the way that the U.S. has not. But so yeah, there's the issue of the timing. I think where I would have differences with some other people who consider themselves pro dirty break is on. I think many of them sort of have a somewhat fatalistic view that our task is just we run left candidates on the Democratic Party ballot line. That heightens the contradictions. Those contradictions explode. New party forms. I think that is not putting enough emphasis. I think it's putting too much emphasis on heightening the contradictions and not enough emphasis on let's prepare that when that crisis hits, it resolves in our favor. I think we need to be laying the groundwork now so that when that showdown happens, we have the means to stand on our own 2 feet. And so that requires doing party building work in the run up to that, not waiting for that to happen and then scrambling to try and throw together what we need to do a new party and sort of being taken unawares. I think we need to we need to take that knowledge and integrate it into our planning. So I think there's that piece. On the question of the taking only a worker's wage and not accepting corporate donations, I mean, I think, yeah, we would have no perspective that the Democratic Party takes on either of those things. I think again, the goal is not to reform the Democratic Party. They are not going to accept either of those policies. I do think they wouldn't, I mean, whatever, an individual candidate could take on those policies of their own. Bernie Sanders didn't accept corporate donations and, I think out fundraised others who did. So, I mean, I think Bernie Sanders showed that it can be done, that you can run a viable national level campaign for the highest office, without accepting corporate donations. And so it follows that you could certainly do that for other offices as well that are less spendy. But so I think that's not actually a disadvantage. I think it's an advantage, and also both you can raise more money from regular working class supporters by taking that approach, and you can have more credibility taking that approach. I think even most people in DSA do not agree and probably will not agree for some time on the taking only a worker's wage issue. So, that's sort of, I agree with that, but that hasn't been the thing that that's not the hill I'm going to die on in the immediate term, even though I think that is what we should do as a principled approach, mainly because I think let's say we form a new party and it becomes viable, you run into the issue of careerism, right? People, the current far left wing of the Democrats will become the far right wing of that new party. And, you will have people who are trying to run on that, in that new party to be the big fish in a little pond and get some lucrative career positions or whatever. And I think you want to guard against that. You want your elected officials to be in the same boat as the median working class person. And so I think, limiting the take home pay to that of the median household income of a working class family is totally reasonable, and is something that, I think we should do the same thing with union officials and stuff like that. Frankly, I think there's union officials who are making way more than their members, and members living on the verge of poverty, whereas they're living quite comfortably, making more than I do with a doctorate doing scientific research, and they're representing grocery store employees, making minimum wage. So I think maybe if they're union, not minimum wage, but certainly maybe $15 an hour or something like that. So yeah, I think that's aspirational, but I don't expect that to be taken up. I don't expect to convince people in the short term on that.
Would you say that this is the question in DSA right now? Like, what else is DSA, like, to me, this is the question. Like, what else is DSA concerned about, right? I mean, it's got these elected officials who are, DSA members, but it doesn't have the ability. I mean, it doesn't have the ability to do anything about a DSA candidate. It seems the question to me is, both what position to adopt. But let's say you adopt a clean break position too. How does DSA? You talked about it a bit, but like to be more like a party. How does DSA be able to actually have to hold the feet to the fire of people who it's easy for me to realize that if you run as a DSA candidate and not as a Democrat, right? So if you were saying like you said, we choose 10 elections and we run DSA candidates that are beholden to the DSA and the sort of rank and file of DSA and the leadership of the DSA and the platform in which they sort of all agree that they're going to run on as DSA candidates, the DSA platform. All of the candidates who don't run as DSA candidates, the ability for DSA to have any ability to hold their feet to the fire is pretty nil, because they're really reliant on the Democratic Party to have gotten them elected, not DSA. And so is this just another reason why it's only dirty break because that's going to then do that kind of bring out the contradiction that DSA can't control the DSA Democrats, and so we've got to move. If we have success with running our own candidates, then we need to do that more because we can actually hold their feet to the fire, whereas the DSA Dems can become Dems.
Well, I think it depends on the model that you used when you run in the Democratic Party. So yeah, I think you're totally accurate if you use the current model where or the current dominant model where some person who happens to be a DSA member says, I'm going to run for this position. And then they run a campaign, they seek DSA's endorsement, DSA provides the endorsement, but it's not like it was some collective DSA decision to run them. It's not like their primary funding and promotion base comes from DSA. It's not, they're sort of a side thing. And it's not like they're promoting DSA the whole time they're running and telling people to join and really identifying themselves super publicly in every speech with them. It's sort of just one thing among many, in their background. And so I think, yeah, in that basis, there's no good way to hold them accountable because they don't need DSA to have gotten elected. It's sort of
I remember Aaron when there was a candidate that DSA was talking about, and then they got a police endorsement, right? And that was like a big issue in DSA, right? Because there was a disagreement and there was no consolidation in DSA about how to think about that endorsement or whether or not you then remove the DSA endorsement because of it. And I remember that being what a frustrating experience to not even know how you're going to deal with all of the other things that come with running an election, right? You might have somebody who's a DSA candidate who gets an endorsement that you didn't expect or maybe didn't even want, but there was no ability for DSA to have any it didn't know what the hell it was going to do in response to that. And I think it created some rifts within even the organization,
Absolutely. Yeah. It was a huge source of conflict for us for a couple months at least. I mean, and the police endorsement was not even necessarily accepted. It wasn't explicitly refused, but that was enough to cause kind of a fissure as to whether we should, retract our endorsement or whether we should let it slide. And it did. It caused a lot of issue. And I'm trying to think of the candidate's name, and I don't remember. But Yeah, I mean, there are tons of questions that come with just the position that we're currently in as someone who endorses candidates and promotes them and tries to hold them, you know, baseline accountable for adhering to the things that they promise when they run. Once we get to the point where we're actually running our own candidates, selecting our own candidates, and doing that, I mean, the complexity grows tenfold, and that's kind of, I guess, that's kind of why my initial perspective was to kind of focus more on a clean break strategy, to where we're not, I understand they're not mutually exclusive. You can certainly run candidates as Democrats, while, as you've said, we can be preparing our own platform and running candidates under another banner. But it feels complicated to try to do that and to try to maintain some accountability for these candidates, and to also push the agenda of moving people away from the Democratic Party when we are running candidates and the Democratic Party. Trying to do them both at once seems like a juggling act that is a challenge. And I mean, it introduces a lot more complexity to the platforms that we can maintain, the positions that we can have, the messaging we can have. And the other question, I mean, the thing I was thinking about, sorry, I know it's kind of just to follow up on that, what I was thinking about recently was this idea that you mentioned earlier. The Republican Party is kind of starting to show these cracks and the potential that they may break off, splinter off. My current assessment of that is that it's probably going to be a more moderate and centrist party that breaks off if it happens, rather than a more extreme one. I feel like the majority of the GOP has kind of gotten beyond what the centrist position is. And so my question is, if we pursue the dirty break strategy and keep putting, I guess, more radical, more progressive people into the Democratic Party, could that potentially drive more of the moderate Democrats, more of the centrists, into what may be a future Republican Party, or a conservative party at that point? So it's a question of which one would you rather, which direction would you rather have the Democratic Party splintering off into? Would you rather build a small far left party and have, the progressives of that slowly drain in, or would you rather try to infiltrate the Democratic Party more so than, we have, and have the centrist people go to a more moderate centrist Republican Party?
That's, I mean, the frustrating thing, I think, is that and this I think goes to the thing about DSA that DSA feels to me, if you started your own third party, like you were like, hey, we're gonna, frankly, I tried to do something like this even just locally within DC, was to say, like, let's reach out to the PSL and the SP and whatever's in the CP and everybody who's like on the even anti-capitalist left, and let's organize a Syriza kind of coalition of the radical left in DC to run a slate of candidates, right? So like that would propose a platform, and like I reached out to the organizations to even suggest it, and like 3 of them were like sure, and then 2 of them like didn't respond, and one of them was like fuck no, right? So that was a very vivid experience for me. It was like, all right, starting a third party, like just even like declaring, it's like the only person in the United States of America right now who could declare that they're going to do a third party and it would work is Bernie Sanders. And I don't know about you guys, but it's fucking infuriating that he doesn't do it. Like I love Bernie, and I moved to Vermont. He's now my senator. But like, motherfucker, like, what the hell? Like, what's stopping you from doing it, right? And I think that I don't know the answer to that question. To me, it's like, I guess it's just a personal thing with Bernie that he doesn't want to do it, which is frustrating. But he's like the only person that could possibly, like, sort of through sheer force of like who he is and the movement that's around him and all that kind of stuff, coalesce the different kind of groups into something that could have a discussion as part of a founding convention to say, what is this platform? And obviously DSA would be a major part of that and stuff like that. You could do that. But barring Bernie saying he's going to do it, declaring that you're going to start a third party and you want everybody to come and have that convention, I think you get like 6 people, and like you might feel like Lenin found in the, like the wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but it's a different time and it's a different place, and it's like fucking not going to work. And so but the issue is, like, if you're talking about DSA trying to move from what it is, which is like this big tent hodgepodge, like let's have an influence, to like a political party, I mean, first of all, it's difficult and it will take time, and that's all fine. But one fear that I have is that the frustrating thing about America and American politics, like having gotten a degree in political science and stuff, is that like you literally learn, unlike other countries, American political parties are only there for the purpose of getting people elected. And then while they're elected, making sure that they all coalesce and vote the same. But other parties in the world have social clubs, and like the kid, like kids go to summer camp from their like parents' party and stuff like that, which is kind of weird. But like, they're much more expansive organizations that bring people in and create community ties and like make you feel like you're part of something whole. Whereas like if you're, I joined the Democratic Party to vote for Bernie in a closed primary, and like ain't nobody reached out to me. I wasn't part of that party. Like it was just on paper so that I could vote in the primary, because the whole purpose of the party is just to do elections. And so DSA right now has this whole other aspect of it where they are kind of like a social group, and they're able to like do events and hold conversations and do all these interesting things that you'd want to maintain. But let's say DSA in the next convention adopts the kind of legitimate dirty break and a set of 4 or 5 principles that is going to be the agreement that they must run on. And as you said, Brandon, we're going to put $100,000 because DSA's got a lot of fucking money, so they could put $100,000 down and do this kind of stuff. The fear, though, is that in this movement towards running your own candidates, right? Let's use the Dems like when we can, because they've got this electoral whole structure. DSA adopts it and loses the kind of bigger, more interesting political party stuff that you see in other places, and just becomes a kind of electoral group. So one, it's going to be difficult to even get to the point where you're going to be able to run the elections. But what about the fear of it turning into just another kind of party that's got a platform that, that is just there to take power in the Congress rather than like institute larger social change? I mean, is that a fear that you have, Brandon, or do you think that that's way too far in the future to worry about? Or, I mean, you don't want to get bit in the ass when you weren't prepared for it.
I think it's a real danger, of course, but I mean, there's no magic bullet that makes that danger go away. The only way you ever guard against that sort of thing is politically through continuing to have democratic discussion and debate within the organization, so that the broad base of the party united around these ideas is able to sort of hold the party apparatus accountable and keep it on track with those professed goals and methods and things like that. There's no way around that. There's no, like, aside from democratic checks and balances, there's no magic way to ensure any of that. It has to be active, ongoing process of reaffirming that. So, and I think that's one reason why internal democracy is so important in organizations, is because it's very, very, very easy to make a sort of crust at the top of an organization, like to get off track or to be bribed or coerced or blackmailed or, whatever. I mean, a million different things, assassinated. I don't know, like as long as you have that kind of disconnect, it's never gonna be solid. You're never gonna, it's super shaky. And so that's why you need to have a structure that makes it so that the party leaders and candidates and things like that are reliant for their support on the DSA. And so that's one thing to go back. Like, I think that even while we're running candidates on Democratic Party ballot lines, there are ways to make that dynamic more the case by restricting sources of funding and by, making it more, having DSA more, pick the candidates, pick the races, pick the program, have it start with the collective process in DSA and be based around that, rather than around people who just independently decide they're going to run and then DSA endorses after the fact, which is sort of a different animal, in my opinion. So I think there's still ways, even if you were going to go inside the Democratic Party, to further that dynamic. I do think but yeah, either way, like to me, it'll be instructive to have the different cases side by side. Like again, I think it would be best if this more DSA centric model were the case in every single race across the country that DSA is involved in. But I think that's not realistic. Like the reality is right now, almost none or almost none are on that model. And so it, like, to me, putting forward, let's do 10 races where it's sort of independent, doing it like this, like that is a way that I think, like, I mean, and 10 is an arbitrary number. It might be more or less, but
it feels doable.
But yeah, something that seems reasonable, but nonetheless would sort of push the envelope in the direction that I think things need to go. Because again, I think if Marxists don't do anything, don't intervene, the reality is going to be that it just keeps going the way it is for the time being, that individuals decide to run, they run as Democrats, DSA endorses after the fact and has no accountability mechanism or control over the campaign. And I think I think there's broad desire in DSA to find ways to make candidates be more accountable. And I think the question of accountability is inseparable from the question of making DSA more party-like and running more on a party decision basis rather than on a sort of endorsing after the fact basis. The other thing I think to think about is, like, it's actually a little weird and frustrating to me that they haven't made more use in New York of the fusion voting laws, because that's an example where you can have your cake and eat it too, in the sense of, like, you can run on a separate Democratic Socialist ballot line if you wanted, but then also compete for the Democratic Party endorsement at the same time. Where you can have your name listed under more than one ballot line. And so, like, that sort of allows you to campaign among the Democratic Party base, but also among the general electorate for, at the same time, and sort of have the best of both worlds. And so, like, I feel like there's not enough currently, like, looking to take advantage of those openings. There's just kind of a knee-jerk habit of going and using the Democratic Party ballot line and doing it that way, where it's not only not necessary, but not even advantageous. I think in a lot of cases, in local races where the electorate is totally dominated by one party and the other party has no chance or doesn't even bother to run sometimes, there's lots and lots of districts like that across the country, where, in my mind, it would be better to run as an independent or on your own ballot line than in the Democratic primary, especially if it's a closed primary, because the primary electorate is understandably more slanted towards party loyalists. Those are the ones most heavily involved in the internal life of the party, most likely to be registered as party members. It's very unlikely that, like, regular, not politically active, like, working class people are going to be, like, registered with a political party months ahead of time in order to vote in the primary or whatever that. And so I think, like, it's actually better to be able to campaign amongst the general electorate from the beginning than to have to try and win among the more centrist party loyalists that vote in Democratic Party primaries. So I think, like, even on pragmatic grounds, I think there's a lot of reasons to be looking for openings to run independently in the short term. But also, I just think even Eric Blanc, who is the one who originally coined the term dirty break and has advanced this strategy, said that any viable dirty break strategy requires that seeking every opportunity to also run independently where possible. And so I think that piece has been largely missing. I mean, there's DSA candidates that have run not in the Democratic Party ballot line, but that's mainly been in nonpartisan races where it's just sort of not an issue. But I tend to think even in nonpartisan races where it's not an issue, we should make it an issue. I think that should be programmatically part of what we put forward in everything we do, is the need for a working class political
and to identify where the Democrats have essentially given up, right? Because there's a huge, like you were saying, there's just huge places where the Democrats just say, like, fuck it, we're never going to win, and so and that's their perspective. Cool. It'd be very interesting, and again, from a strategic perspective, just to have, even if DSA doesn't win the seat, to run the election, to go through the process of making sure the candidate is legally able to do so, and all of these kinds of things is all the kind of training that you would need to then legitimately challenge the capitalist duopoly of the Republicans and the Democrats, because they are two wings of the same party, right? They're both committed to pretty standard, bourgeois liberalism. It's just different, versions of liberalism, and so to be able to find a place to challenge both of them, one because they've abandoned it and the other one because they think they have the stranglehold, is just a perfect place to cut your teeth. Okay.
Totally.
One more question as we kind of wrap up. And so we started this discussion just kind of like, yeah, let's, I want to have an episode on this and it's interesting to talk about. And Aaron and I started out, pretty critical and wanting very, very much more like clean breakers. But over the course of the conversation, I think we've both moved in more of the direction of the dirty break. But Aaron, I want to know, and Brandon, like, I want to hear this from you too afterwards. What's the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, I guess you'd say, right? Like, was there a kind of argument that you thought, man, that's got me, like that is the thing that can, where was the road to Damascus moment for you?
Ultimately, I mean, thinking about the practicality of it, I realize that having a seat at the table, however small or even, ignored or shunned by the Democratic Party, I think it is important. I mean, I think it helps increase the exposure of some of these socialist and leftist ideas, even if we lack the power to actually enforce them or do anything about them. Like I said, AOC's fiery rhetoric, her texts and tweets are great. I mean, they definitely instill some idea of class consciousness, and I think it's better to have that and be able to attach the DSA brand to it and kind of the socialist idea to it than to sit it out and just say, well, we're going to wait until we somehow become powerful enough to do our own thing, and then we're not going to have any seat at the table. So that's thinking on that and really trying to figure out that seems like a better approach than just hoping that we magically coalesce the power and the ability to put forth a completely separate party and an opposition to the powers. That's what got me to change my position.
Brandon, what's the silver bullet argument for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I should note, like, I am new-ish to promoting this line myself. I think, for most of my career as a socialist, I would have advocated more of a clean break strategy myself. And the argument I would have made in the past, I mean, from the beginning, I've never treated the question of the Democratic Party ballot line as a principle. I've always seen it as a tactical question. But I would have argued that tactically, it is better to have nothing to do, with the Democratic Party. And I would have said that, the argument I would have made in the past was, look, if I thought promoting the Democrats and helping the Democrats win was going to make any sort of positive change, any sort of small difference, like that was truly beneficial to working class people, like I'd be in favor of that. But I don't buy it. Like, I think that if anything, it has the opposite effect, that simply by telling people to vote for the Democrats, like you make you lower their consciousness, or you promote the lowering of their consciousness. I'd point to statistics like, under Bush, there's all the people who were against the war and calling Bush a fascist and stuff. And then Obama takes over, and you have 75% of self-described liberal Democrats polled saying that they support things like drone strikes in Guantanamo because Obama's doing them. Mm-hmm. That's not a step forward politically. That's a step back. The Democrats are, like this would have been my line of argument, I think, in the past, which I actually still agree with all of those arguments. But I just think there's sort of more, there's more to it than that as well. So I think either way, like, I'm trying to think if there was something that was like the moment where I was like, okay, instantly I'm convinced of this. And I don't remember some like one piece like that, but I think the thing that made it clear to me more was just being more confident in being able to separate out questions of principle, political principle, and policy from questions of tactics.
Yeah.
And how, of course, there's a relationship, but like, and the principles come first. But then once you've sort of made sure you're firm on those principles, you can be very flexible on what tactics you take. And I think like the reality is, I think one of the differences is for most of the time that I've been a socialist, there has not been a big, mass movement of near 100,000 people. That is the socialist movement. The socialist movement is centered around, and where these attempts are being had. I think the question was inherently a bit more abstract for most of the time I've been active. And so in my analysis was also a bit more abstract, I think. And it was more a question of propagandistically winning people over to the idea that we need a third party. And it was this ideological battle because either way, the forces sort of weren't that there wasn't these big active forces that were trying to figure out how to do this. But then when you make it more concrete, when you say, okay, there exists this mass group of people that's like trying to figure this out, and how do I sort of make an impact on that? It just sharpens the question of devising tactics that are effective at doing that. And so my political principles and views on the question of the Democratic Party haven't changed one iota over the past 15 years, but I think the question of what the immediate tasks are in relation to the existing movement have changed. And I think also with that, my sort of tactical approach to that has changed and become a bit more nuanced. But that's the best I can do. I don't have a silver bullet thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think as socialists, I think we have this sometimes annoying, but I think useful tendency to look into history, look at the example that history provides, and even within specifically, socialist movements. And I think that if you look at the difference between the two revolutions in 1917 in Russia and the different revolutions that were happening between 1918 and 1923 or so in Germany, the flexibility in the tactical approaches, both sides were fairly rigid in their principles, but the flexibility that the Russians showed in terms of having to deal with the Tsarist state and the war and all of then the provisional government and like all of these, the maneuvering that happens, right? It makes it hard to read Lenin as if he was a pronunciator of because you read Lenin from the difference between February and April, and it's like, the fuck, like this sounds a lot different. It's like, well, yeah, because the shit changed and the tactics changed, and like sometimes you say, no, you're not gonna do anything with the provisional government, and it's other times it's like, shit, we got to run like a bunch of candidates because we got to figure out what we're gonna do. That's
something I've always admired about Lenin is that he's so firm on principles over and over again, but so accommodating and flexible on tactics, and it's really admirable and consistent.
Exactly. And then you look at the German, the sort of the German Communist Party and German revolutionaries, like obviously not being as flexible. Now the situations are different, sure, but just like the rigidity can be a significant hindrance towards actually achieving your goals, because though it seems pure, and it may be pure, it's not successful. And so, we all, and I think, maybe it's like there's part of me that doesn't want to make this point, but I think there is something to be said about the fiery nature of youth, especially, I came to these ideas when I was 15, years old. And so I was ready to like fucking burn down my own high school. I don't know. I was like, what, like, I just want, I was very like invigorated by the revolutionary aspect of this, right? And wanted to like make sure that I was absolutely rigid and never going, so I was like never going to run an election, fuck all that kind of stuff. And there's a huge trend in DSA that still maintains that perspective. But I think that maybe it's a little bit of age, but it's also experience with the fact that like I am also really sick of losing. And, I've been involved in organizations and, was a member of Social Alternative, which was nice to have one person elected, but went through two campaigns that didn't work, and so I'm sick of losing, and I want to find the strategy that seems most pragmatic and most calculated to win. And so, like, for me, having the discussion of just like trying to throw every kind of criticism at the dirty break strategy that you could think of, not even necessarily from like doing some like it just what about principle, but even just like testing out the real pragmatic nature of this. It just seemed for me like this is the most pragmatic. This is what a good Marxist does, which is to look at the material conditions to say, how do the material conditions sort of give me the space to be able to maintain my principles, but actually get somewhere. And, you know, the genius of this dirty break idea is that it recognizes the situation that we're in. It doesn't pretend that we're in this, like, we're, you know, at best we're in a pre-revolutionary moment, but we certainly aren't in any way able to, you know, we're not in sort of the ability to lead some kind of revolutionary change. So we have to move the ball forward towards that. What's a way to do that? By building up the force so that we can be an actual legitimate political entity in terms of getting people into positions of power, but then also to be able to maintain control over those people and direct how those people are actually doing things, while simultaneously showing that trying to do it another way isn't going to be successful. And you may have moderate gains, but you're ultimately not going to have the kind of control and ability to move the ball forward that you want. And so you simultaneously build the party that you want and show that any other strategy that we've tried to do or that we could possibly do isn't going to work. So you get, you know, you have your cake and eat it too. And for me, that was enough for me to go, yeah, all right, dirty break. Cleanest of dirty breaks, but dirty nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I'm realizing that I think another thing that moved me in that direction was just, you know, I would look at other people who advocated an approach like that, like, yes, we need a new party, but for now we work within the Democrats. And I think just looking at that, like, I think prior to a certain point, I had the analysis that was essentially like, well, look, these people have just, they're not actually building towards anything new, and they've just been corrupted by the Democrats, and, you know, it's not going anywhere or whatever. But then, yeah, I think looking at that long enough, I sort of thought or realized, like, wait, it's not them running on the Democratic Party ballot line that is actually the thing that is the sort of that is holding this process up. Like, them doing that isn't actually the sticking point. The sticking point is they're not building something new while they're doing it. And so it was sort of like seeing the failures of the dirty break strategy, ironically, sort of, I think, led me to see, like, here's concretely where it fails and how that could be fixed, and therefore how the dirty break strategy can be good and not fall into the pitfalls that it currently has. So yeah, I think, you know, the article that I co-wrote is not just sort of, or even mainly, frankly, arguing in favor of the dirty break, though it is doing that. It's also trying to sort of define what does a viable dirty break implementation look like, because I think that is very contested territory, and I think we're in currently quite a small minority of, or I'm representing quite a small minority view within DSA of what the dirty break looks like. I think there's a much bigger section of people that support the dirty break than would support all the version of it that I'm saying. And so,
more dirty break, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, or to me, it's just a question of including the break part more.
Right.
Like,
yeah. Are we going to be dirty? Or are we going to break? Yeah. Okay. So I think this is very helpful. I mean, I've had people reach out to me even from the last podcast episode saying, like, hey, I heard this dirty break thing. You know, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I think that for a lot of people, you know, DSA might look like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But the interesting thing is, like, you know, DSA is its own thing, its own organization. It's having these discussions and it's moving, you know, in different directions. And so the cool thing about DSA is, as Aaron is an example of, you can be quite active or you can not be. And the like parting question I guess I have for you, Aaron, is, does the dirty break discussion make you more interested in getting more you know, back involved, or has your experience just totally soured? You're not coming back?
No, not the dirty break question particularly specifically, but yeah, I mean, I do have a desire to get back involved, and I don't quite know how or where to do that personally. I don't know at what level, but I definitely do. I mean, I do want to be a part of it. I specifically maintained my membership in DSA, not because I lost faith in the organization, but because I just got burnt out. But I just, and that was me just taking on more than I needed to, rather than any real failure of the organization. So I do. I mean, I want to see DSA succeed. I want to see some kind of a break strategy succeed, and I do think some variation of the dirty break is probably the way to go. I do have some, reservations about it, and I think maybe my way of getting involved is to try to, raise those and see how Brandon or others can address them. But yeah, I think it's an exciting time.
So, as a way of parting, just want to make sure that Aaron, I know that you've been starting at least to write some of your thoughts down and things like that. Any idea of making that stuff public? You wanna direct people to where they can find out more about how you think about stuff, or is it not ready yet? What are you doing?
Not quite yet. No, it's still percolating. That's going to be definitely much more on the kind of the lipsock side that you and I have talked about. So probably outside of the electoral discussions, but yeah, I'll come on here and promote it eventually.
All right, right on. And Brandon, we talked before, but how can people find out, the issues of Dirty Break, but stuff, find out where you're coming from, what you've been writing?
Yeah, totally. My stuff is on reformandrevolution.org, where you can, find stuff on the Dirty Break, and a bunch of other issues. And certainly anyone who's interested, who, finds these ideas compelling and would like to, work together to try and promote them inside DSA, I really encourage you to get in touch. I'll give to Kevin the info links, my email, whatever, just so people can get in touch if they want.
Dangerous, man, putting your email on a podcast.
I know, I'm not up on security culture. I've been doxxed already. Who cares? It's out there.
Right. Take it with a badge of honor. Fuck it.
Yeah, may as well just lean into it.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate this. Those people who are watching, this is an ongoing discussion. This is a stay tuned kind of moment, and I think this is a great place to get involved. This podcast is one of my intentions on at least bringing out these ideas, and wanting to have a discussion about those. Be interested to have a discussion with those who are more in favor of the realignment policy and trying to bring out, the best of those, because there are, it's not as if there aren't good arguments for why you do that. The question will be, where we stand on how, essentially our faith in the success of these kinds of things, and how we view the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes and the Rashida Tlaibs, and there are difference of opinions, and it's a valid discussion, and it's good to have those discussions, because that is part of a democratic organization, being open and able to have these discussions and compete with each other, and to do so out in the open and in a way that gives everybody the perspective they want to take, and hopefully a place for people to have those discussions where we don't go to war, but we find out where we're really at. So this is my little bit of trying to do that. So appreciate you guys having coming on and talking about that. And as things progress, we'll come back to it and see how it's going. I think the next convention will be a very interesting time. But if you're in DSA, participate in this discussion. And if you're not in DSA, think about being part of it anyway. I think that this is something that anybody who's interested in leftist politics and the question of electoral politics and what we do about it is the perfect place to have this discussion. So have it. Check out Reform and Revolution, and when Aaron gets all of his non-electoral stuff ready, you can check that stuff out. So, all right, guys, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.